Yes, I'm delighted to be joined by Luke de Pulford, who is a fellow of Hong Kong Watch, also the co-founder of the Coalition for Genocide Response. So thank you very much for your time. Now, the obvious place to start is the UK yesterday made an offer where Hong Kong national or British nationals living in Hong Kong can potentially come to the UK for another 6 months and potentially get citizenship. I mean, do you think that's a sufficient response?
It's a step on the way towards a sufficient response. The truth of the matter is that we made promises to the people of Hong Kong and we need to honour them. This is a good way of honouring them because it's quite clear that Beijing has absolutely no intention of honouring its promises to Hong Kong. I mean, we've seen the joint declaration, the treaty negotiated between the UK and China, totally destroyed, detonated 27 years early. And that puts us in a position where we are forced to confront what are very, very heavy obligations to the people of Hong Kong. We promised them that we would defend their high degree of autonomy and their way of life. Both of those two things have been utterly destroyed and undermined by the passing of the national security law. So the ball's in our court. What we've done on B&O is very, very welcome. British national overseas passport holders are going to be able to come here. And the scheme, as we understand it, is to move towards giving them citizenship. But even better than that would be to come together with other nations internationally and say that we will pursue an international scheme to give freedom-loving Hong Kongers a place to live. That would be very powerful. It would send a very strong, unified signal to Beijing when we're needing it more than anything else. But what I would say is that the B&O thing, these British national overseas passport holders, that they do not account for most of the people on the streets in Hong Kong. So most of the people on the streets in Hong Kong do not qualify because they were born after 1997. Yeah. So this scheme won't touch those who have been giving up so much to defend the way of life of Hong Kong. And our responsibility is not just to B&O passport holders, it's to the people of Hong Kong. So we need to go much, much further, but absolutely welcome Dominic Raab and Priti Patel's statements yesterday. It's a major movement from where they were before.
Yeah, thanks. Perhaps you could kind of clear up a little thing that's confusing me. So my understanding is that there's about 300,000 people who could benefit from this scheme. But obviously the population of Hong Kong is more like 7 million, and presumably the population born before 1997 is way more than 300,000. And my understanding is that more than 300,000 originally registered for British national status. I think some maybe have let it lapse. For those that let it lapse, would this scheme not apply at all, or is there some way they can kind of reactivate their British nationality?
So it's actually an extremely complex situation because there have been several different statuses which have been applied to the people of Hong Kong. By the way, always without their permission and never with proper consultation. But for example, there was one status called the British Overseas Dependent Territories. I think that's what it was called. And some of those people, if they did not apply for British national overseas passports, are no longer eligible. So there's a whole constituency there that this doesn't apply to. The numbers, we don't really know the numbers is the truth, because since things started to kick off in Hong Kong last year, 2019, around July, the numbers of applications for British national overseas passports went through the roof. Yeah. So the last estimate was, well, we thought there was somewhere over 300,000. If it's fewer than 400,000 now, I would be very, very surprised. And in addition to that, you've got a load of people who would like to have these passports, but who are not eligible for them. So, there are many details here that need to be ironed out. And what I would say is that the UK reserves the right unilaterally to change the status of these passports or any other scheme. We could create any scheme that we want to help the people of Hong Kong, and we should.
Because I mean, in the Chinese, I think so one of the Chinese authorities put out a statement basically saying that if the UK changes their status, it will be regarded as the UK interfering in internal Chinese affairs and threatening some kind of unspecified retaliation. I mean, does that worry you? Do you think we should take that seriously? I mean, is that Beijing interfering in our internal affairs?
It's yeah. I mean, I like that description. It is Beijing interfering in our internal affairs because we can offer citizenship to whomever we like, and we have treaty obligations to Hong Kong. But the most important thing to point out there is that what they are saying in this very, very aggressive way just isn't true. The the livelihood, the well-being of the people of Hong Kong is our responsibility too, under an international treaty lodged at the United Nations that China also signed. So what they're saying is flatly untrue. We have that responsibility and we're trying to stand by that responsibility, and that is a very, very good thing. But we're not at all surprised by this. You know, the way that China has conducted its foreign policy for some time now has been outrageously aggressive, confrontational. So we've seen today that there have been threats to the UK that if we decide to go down this line, there are going to be unspecified reprisals. Well, surprise, surprise, that's what China always does. The Foreign Office will have known that when they decided to make this change. We totally expected. And bring it on, I say. We're not going to be bullied by you.
Yeah, I was interested that you mentioned a kind of coordinated international response. And obviously the UK put out a joint statement with the US, Australia and Canada, which was quite strongly worded. But it seemed to me that there was less European response. I mean, I think the French government put out a statement basically saying it's internal Chinese affairs. I mean, have you been kind of surprised by how weak the European response has been?
Yes, in some ways. I thought we were going to get something much stronger from Germany. I thought Angela Merkel's statement was profoundly weak and just not recognizing the clear and obvious reality of the violation of an international treaty by China and the abandonment of the people of Hong Kong, which is their responsibility too, by the way, because they are also custodians of the joint declaration by virtue of it being lodged at the United Nations. So I was surprised. The only thing that I would say is that the geopolitical map is being redrawn before our very eyes very quickly. And I think people are struggling to keep up. You know, for a long time, people's foreign policy towards China has gone through this whole mangle. You know, how is it going to affect us? How is our economy going to be damaged if we take these kinds of decisions? Well, I think that people now realize that they're not going to play that game anymore, but it's taking some time for governments to wake up to the fact that China has made itself a pariah state by doing the things that it has done. There will be huge repatriation of supply chains from China. There is a massive recalibration of international foreign policy towards China. It's happening before our eyes, and I think they're just a bit slow. I think Europe has been slow to cotton on to what is a seismic geopolitical change.
I mean, do you think the UK is fully cottoned on yet? I mean, obviously there's talk about kind of revisiting the Huawei decision, but it does sound like there'll still be some role for Huawei in the UK's 5G network. So even with the kind of the toughening of rhetoric and the tough language, do you think we've fully cottoned on to what we're dealing with?
No, I think the UK has also been very slow, but you have to remember, George Osborne sold Whitehall on a vision of the Chinese century, of almost the UK being tethered to China for the next however long, because they were going to be the economic power in this century. So that is deeply embedded in Whitehall. What we found in our campaigning is that we kept coming up against that. So it didn't matter how many times we talked about, you know, the enslavement of hundreds of thousands of Turkic Muslims in Western China and how the UK needed to do something about that. You know, there might be some movement on it, but it would always be diminished by the fact that we didn't want to upset China because of economic interests. And, you know, we are now moving beyond that stage. I think increasingly the UK is now beginning to decouple from China. I think that would be fair to say. What has happened with Huawei is a big deal and really signals the UK's intention. But it's not just the UK, this is going to be happening all over the world. Australia is going to be doing this. Europe will have to come round. The US has been doing it for some time. You know, it will be free world, unfortunately, versus China on this stuff.
I mean, kind of turning to the pro-democracy protesters in Hong Kong, as people like Joshua Wong, I mean, presumably their status now is incredibly precarious. I mean, because obviously when this new law goes through, they could be, you know, could get huge sentences under Chinese law. I mean, is there anything that specifically can be done to help them, or will they be included? Well, I guess they wouldn't be included in the British National. They're probably too young. Is there anything specific we can do to help them? Or?
Well, I think this is one of the reasons that a scheme just to help British national passport holders is inadequate, because it doesn't help people like that. It's not just Joshua, it's many, many others. I mean, imagine the legislators who were arrested in the group of 15 not so long ago for apparently, you know, on suspicion of sedition under the national security law. That's turbocharged. And I've had messages from legislators saying that they don't even want to talk to me because they don't believe that it's safe enough now. denying the opportunity to brief international politicians on what's happening in Hong Kong for fear of what will happen to them.
Yeah.
And that shows you the seriousness of this. Now, we have a legal and moral responsibility to these people. We can't abandon them because they don't have B&O passports. You know, we've got to do much better than that, which is why I think there does need to be an international and united push on this. But yes, it's extremely worrying for them. Of course it is. You know, they know the cost of speaking out. They've seen it. And a lot of the stuff that they've seen has gone unreported because it happens behind closed doors, not in the full glare of the media, like most of the protests. Yeah. So they're fully aware of the risks that they're taking. We owe it to them to stand with them and to say, you know, you're not alone, guys. Your way of life is the thing that you're defending, that we promised that we'd defend for you. So we've got a responsibility there.
Yeah. I mean, kind of turning to the Uyghur situation, I mean, that must be kind of, you know, one of the most grotesque ongoing human rights abuses in the world. I mean, you know, I don't think anyone's so sure about the exact numbers, but somewhere like 1 million people in re-education camps where, you know, I've read widespread reports of torture and abuse and so on. And to be honest, it's been getting very little attention in the West. I mean, compared to the Hong Kong situation, which is obviously, you know, also very tragic. But I mean, why do you think the West has been so disinterested in what's been going on in Uyghur?
That's a very difficult question to answer because there are many facets to it. I think the first thing is that it's very opaque. So it's hard to see what's happening to the Uyghurs. You know, for a long time, even people in the anti-slavery community were silent on the issue because they didn't believe that the evidence base was sufficient. Now, it's not that we haven't got evidence, it's just the visibility is so poor. You know, you can't get in there. You know, journalists aren't allowed to go in and have a look around. Some of the most compelling evidence has been from satellite images, therefore, of, for example, Uyghur graveyards, which have been bulldozed by the Chinese government. The reason I think the conversation has moved on a bit is that we had leaks showing that Xi Jinping himself said, quote unquote, that no mercy should be shown to Uyghur Muslims. And some of the aspects of the program of detention, extrajudicial detention for Turkic Muslims have come out through leaks. That's been very powerful, but also we've had huge reams of research now taken that have been analyzing government data, the Chinese government data, really getting to the bottom of the size and breadth and severity, barbarism of what's happening to Uyghur Muslims. So I think that what I'd say about it is that it has been quite hard for the media, which wants to verify, to speak about this for that reason. And when you've got these aggressive ambassadors saying that it's all fake news and it's made up, you know, it's quite hard if you're a media figure who doesn't necessarily know, you know. You hear these reports about what's happening to Uyghurs, and then you get what should be a credible figure given a platform saying that it's all been made up. It's difficult. You need to have a very strong evidence base. So I think that's one of the reasons. The other issue is that China owns everything. You know, China's in our media and exerts a huge amount of influence over media outlets all over the world, many other institutions as well. People are muzzled by this because they fear that they will lose the investment that they currently enjoy if they start talking about what China is doing in Western China. Yeah. So I think that all of those things play into that. I also think that it's just very far away, and people right now are looking to their own thresholds. People are very worried about this virus. Yeah. And it's having a huge effect at home. It's hard for people to look over at a place that they can't really see and imagine the plight of what we think is at least 1 million Turkic Muslims detained and mistreated in Xinjiang.
Yeah. I mean, I guess it must be particularly hard for developing countries to speak out. I mean, it's been kind of noticeable that a lot of Muslim countries have been quite quiet, or in some cases even slightly complicit. Yeah. And a lot of those are ones that are going to benefit from the Belt and Road Initiative. I mean, do you think, is this a kind of a foretaste of what's to come? Is China's growing power going to enable it to get away with more and more amongst poorer sections of the world?
Yes, I think so. I think, unfortunately, the Belt and Road Initiative has provided a very helpful muzzling tool for particularly Islamic nations preventing them from speaking out about their co-religionists in Western China. The classic example would be a letter that was drawn up by the UK at the UN to speak about what was happening to Uyghurs.
Yeah.
And China heard about this, got very upset, and organized their own counter letter with more signatures, which included all of the signatures from Islamic nations that you would have expected to be upset about what was happening to their co-religionists in Xinjiang. Now that happened. Why? It happened because of the huge investments that China is putting into their countries and the influence they therefore exert over them. So this is a situation that we've walked into and have allowed to happen. We've allowed China to pursue an aggressively expansionist foreign policy, which has allowed them to own countries to the extent that they can't even speak about what's happening in Western China. That's the situation that we've got to.
I've been talking about China's aggressive foreign policy. Obviously, there's kind of two areas in the world where there are border disputes involving the Chinese state, which could potentially turn hot. So first of all, obviously in India, I believe quite recently Chinese troops across the border, or a contested area, but what the Indians regard as their territory, and are still there as far as I'm aware. And obviously the other one is the South China Sea. I mean, do you think we should take seriously the possibility of a war breaking out between some major power, be it India or the United States, and China? That's
certainly the rhetoric. And if you look at what China has been saying over the past few days and the kinds of behavior that we've seen, particularly the odd little military test here and there, and the kinds of statements they've been making, clearly that distant drumbeat is there in the background. And given the rapidity of everything at the moment, it's extremely worrying. My hope would be that the international community coming together and making an extremely strong economic statement about what the effect of, what the consequences are for this kind of behavior might prevent escalation. There is an urgent need for governments to come together to look at how they can de-escalate what's happening with China at the moment, because I have been consistently surprised by the ability of Xi Jinping to do exactly the wrong thing for his own reputation and for the reputation of China. Keeps doing the wrong thing. So it is quite within his gift to do something really stupid in South China Sea and unite the rest of the world against him even more. But we need to anticipate this. We can't allow Taiwan to be treated the way that it's likely to be treated now. So we've heard statements even today come from the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs saying, if they keep behaving the way they are, if we keep seeing the sorts of statements that we are from Taiwan, we're not ruling out military action. So that's what they're saying today. So it's quite clear the threat that we will face and the need for the international community to come together very, very urgently to look at de-escalation and how they might achieve that through economic sanctions and other means.
I mean, there's been talk, I think, in the papers this morning of kind of the UK leading or trying to help set up a kind of international coalition, I think, of the G7 plus Canada, not Canada, plus Australia, India, and I remember maybe Japan. I can't remember what the other one was. I mean, do you think that's the kind of direction we should be going in, some kind of international coalition to constrain China, involving both Western powers and other Asian powers, its neighbours?
Yes, I do. Unfortunately, I think the situation that we're in right now is that some nations have been, as we mentioned earlier, quite slow to cotton on to what is happening. And therefore, the prospect of there being a quickly convened group which can act quickly seems to me to be quite slim without some serious pressure. So I hope that there will be that. I mean, there needs to be. But a lot of those nations that ought to be involved in it are so in hot to China that it's going to be difficult for them to pursue the kind of punitive measures needed to stop them in their tracks. So we don't just need that. We need an international group of parliamentarians to come together who can hold their governments to account, again making that statement that they stand not just with the people of Hong Kong, but with Uyghurs in Western China and against the aggressive expansionism of Xi Jinping.
Yeah. I mean, one thing I found quite interesting about the Chinese state is they seem to be very open to kind of new technology. So artificial intelligence, gene editing, that kind of thing. So obviously they've got their, I can't remember what it's called, their kind of national surveillance thing where you go, it's a social credit score, I think. I mean, Should we be worried that, do you think that kind of Chinese leaders are paying more attention to some of this stuff than Western leaders? Should Western leaders be paying more attention to, you know, the big advances in AI and gene editing and questions like that?
Yes, I mean, there's kind of one caveat there, which is that China is very well known for stealing the intellectual property of other nations, and particularly creativity around technology, appropriating it, and then developing it in China too. So it would be wrong to try to single out China as leading the world on all of these questions. They are certainly stealing from the rest of the world on all these questions and putting a heck of a lot of resources into developing other people's ideas. But yes, they are developing them in the wrong direction because they're not anchored in the same values.
Yeah.
So we see that some of the facial recognition software that we sold them, the UK has sold China, is now being used to profile Uyghurs and to ensure that this extremely invasive surveillance technology oppresses minorities in China. And yes, we should be worried about that. We can't deal with people on that basis. We can't be providing our technology to people who are going to use it in that way. And if we can't find a strike upon a set of common values with China, which anchor those kinds of deals, those deals cannot be done.
Yeah. I mean, just one final question. I mean, do you think, is there any risk of kind of the Chinese model spreading? So as kind of China's power increases, and it seems to offer kind of a coherent ideological challenge to the liberal democratic Western model, do you think there's more of a risk of other countries going down that route of seeing what Xi Jinping is doing and thinking, I quite like that in my own country?
I think there are certainly belligerent states out there who might look at Xi Jinping's strategy and think, oh, well, that's a good idea. If we go around the world, particularly to poorer nations, and give them a load of money masquerading as development, which just in fact either buys their silence or acquiescence, that's a good foreign policy. Now, there might be certain people thinking that, but they're not in the same position as China. They simply don't have the economic wealth to do it. So I don't think there's anybody around who could ruffle feathers in the way that China is doing at the moment. So there might be people who don't share liberal democratic values who would think that it was a good idea and would aspire to it. I don't think they're in the position to do it. I think also the most important thing is that it's quite clear he's not going to get away with it. People aren't just going to stand by and let it happen.
Yeah. Well, say, Luke, thank you very much for your time. It's been really interesting. Best of luck with all your work. It sounds very important.